Hello everyone, welcome to our workshop on, we had a title, I'm sure about it.
There is a title.
There is a title here, and as much as I remember, it was the Advanced Data Protection Control, a fundamental shift in data protection practices or privacy practices. And as you see, the panel is co-organized by Vienna University of Economics, Sustainable Computing Lab, and NOIP. And we mainly like to present you the ADPC, the Advanced Data Protection Control. And the program that we have today for this session is very interactive. We hope to, have you on board, and we talk together about different dimensions of the ADPC and how it can change how we practice and perceive privacy. We start with Max, and already we are losing some colleagues. Yeah, no worries. We start with Max. He explains what the ADPC is. And then we will have a Q&A, which means if you don't understand the technicalities, if you like to ask clarification questions, you can ask in this first Q&A. Although I'm sure Max will provide also enough input about why do we need it, but I will also reflect more on that after Max. Again, we will have a round of discussion together, and then Alan will provide us with the current, what I called, and he doesn't know it yet because I put it on a slide, the socio-legal environment around the ADPC. Mainly, what are the legal developments in the last year, mainly, from the last year CPDP, and what are the changes, what we can expect. And again, we discuss it together. Finally, whatever remains in your minds, how we can move forward, hopefully together, to make it happen. So, let's start with Max, and here we switch actually to the second slides, and then later we come back to the first one again, and stage is yours.
Cool. Quick question. Who has any clue what ADPC is? Just so that I guess want to. Okay. So we will probably do a bit of a explainer there. So there basically came out of a debate in 2019 mainly about e-privacy. So we had this discussion that there was the idea of including a signaling system into e-privacy, so to get rid of cookie banners, and your browser can basically then signal to the website what the privacy preferences are. And the idea is that that would probably make 90% of people's life nicer. And the big question for us was that in this debate, there was a lot of especially from the industry, kind of that's not doable, it's technically so complicated, blah, blah, blah. And the idea was, let's just do a prototype, put it there to show it's doable and it's not that complicated. This all led to to the guidelines that we have, right, or the, what's the proper word? The specification that we have there, and a prototype that you can also find on the website, which technically already operates. You could also install it in your web browser, and you could kind of play with the website, with our website at least that supports it, to see how actually your privacy preferences would be stored and so on. The whole thing is a cooperation between NOIP, we were from the content, and DVU, the University of Economics in Vienna. What the input of all of that was the W3C debate on the do not track situation, where Alan can talk more about, because he was, you said, wasting years of your life on this, and why the W3C didn't probably get us anywhere. There is the whole idea of GDPR and e-privacy, where it's kind of recommended or foreseen that there's a signal like that, but actually there is no way of really operationalizing it. It says there should be a signal, but no one actually then determines the signal. So no one knows if I would send a signal to a website if they would have to comply with it. Answer, probably not, because no one declared that signal to be the one. And then there's global privacy control in California. So that's kind of the stuff that we looked into. The problems that we had, I just have to turn around because I don't have the monitor there. For do not track and global privacy control, that was an opt-out system, that it's a global setting, not site-specific, that it's only on third-party tracking, and you would still probably have a consent banner that could override the signal, because the question is what happens if there's a signal, but then the website would still ask for consent anyways. Which one is then ruling the exchange? There's usually optional support, so websites just didn't do it. The parts of ADPC that are different than the previous attempts that this would be basically opt-in based. So while the California or American systems are opt-out based, this would be compliant with GDPR opt-in based. There would be the option for an opt-out as well, so a withdrawal or an objection in GDPR terms. That would all be per purpose because the GDPR works on purpose basis and not on third party, first party, so you need to get the purpose into the signal. You can freely define the purposes, so each website can define the purposes where they ask for consent. That could be standardized. For example, the IAB has their purpose list that they think is their proper list, let alone if that's a proper list, but theoretically some industry could define that purpose list. The whole thing would be per domain, so you could have different consent on different domains, which also the kind of opt-out signals are usually not. You usually have a do not track for your whole browser for all the websites. So you could say, okay, that news outlet that I really trust, that I like, I give more permissions than some website that I've only visited once in my life. And the whole thing was designed to be open for other legal systems as well. Obviously, we come from the GDPR tradition, but the idea was how can we make the definition so abstract that they could also work for another jurisdiction and not specifically use the GDPR wording necessarily. So how does that signal work? Basically, if you go to website, there is each kind of element that you load from the website is a transaction. And when you get that transaction from the website, you would already get a list of the purposes that they would ask for consent for. And you could then, in your own machine, send a response back. So basically, you get a question, for example, do you want a cookie from that website? And you would then get a pop-up in your browser, which would be standardized by the browser or a plugin in the browser. So it would be a bit like the, do you give consent to access your webcam kind of button. We all know that. We all know there's two buttons. It's easy. People understand it. Totally different than the cookie banner right now, which is designed by the website to be usually as fucked up as possible. And by removing the design interface from the website and moving it into the browser / a plugin so that not necessarily Google decides how the design looks like, that could overcome these issues. What happens in the background is that there is in the header information of each exchange, you usually have, I'm a lawyer usually as well, but for the lawyer people in the room, you basically have a lot of meta information, which for example says, which language does my browser use? What different technical options does my browser have? And you would add a line there that adds kind of your privacy preferences, just like you have your language preferences in there. And there would be different options for consent. So basically, that's what the website sends out. It has an ID and then basically a request of what you would want to have as a consent. And you would then send back the answer, which is like basically this one line in our example. So it doesn't really add much to the transaction. It would be one additional line saying I consent to these two purposes after the website has broadcasted kind of what they ask for consent for. That's also interesting because if you don't participate in that, you wouldn't have a bigger tracking surface. That is one of the arguments in the US usually for not having too much information is the more you have these information pieces, you could use it for fingerprinting. But in that situation, you would only for websites that already run under that system answer. You don't kind of yourself broadcast what you want. So it's kind of like the website goes first, which would, from a design perspective, make a bit of sense there. That's the most visited website in Austria. That's kind of the do not track line that you would have there. So that's already kind of one of these things you send in the meta information just to get kind of like an understanding of it. And you would basically add an additional line, which is the ADPC signal that you send back. That's kind of fundamentally the idea. There is an option to also kind of withdraw everything. So there is an option to reset because there is a question of syncing. If your browser has different information on what you consented to or not than the server, you need to have a way of syncing that somehow. So the signal would allow, for example, to wipe everything you said previously in a cookie banner or so, and thereby override whatever other information is out there. That's that. Tracking surface, already mentioned that because it's the other way around, you don't have that. The idea is that you have local management so that your browser actually manages your cookie preferences. That could be like in a simple setting, as I said, like as you access a webcam, but it could go much further. For example, you could have like a more intelligent version of doing that. So for example, your browser could not talking about fancy AI or whatever, but for example, as a starting point, say, if you have visited a page not more than 2 or 3 times, I don't even ask you, because the reality is you're not going to be interested in being tracked by a website you only visit once in your life. And also the website is not overly interested in that one person being there once. So it could be interesting to have this kind of smarter management that is then with your browser. But ADPC doesn't do that, so it leaves kind of room for anybody that develops these plugins to come up with smarter ideas of how to manage that. That's basically that. I think that's the most important parts. I don't know what your time planning is.
I think we are. It's better to stop it.
Okay, cool.
And have Hilary ask for clarification questions. So, is it clear what ADPC is? Do you have any questions?
It's.
Or we should ask questions.
Yeah.
You can explain.
I think there's a couple of questions there.
Yeah, please.
I have a question.
You want-
So, this doesn't have a vendor field, right? So, I mean, the idea, I guess, would be that whoever is requesting. Sorry, do you want me to?
Yeah.
This doesn't have a vendor field, as I understand. So the idea is like the organization that the server you're interacting with is considered to be the tracker. In many, obviously this is a kind of controversial area. At the moment, websites typically gain consent in joint controllership arrangements with often hundreds of trackers at the same time. But let's say that was just a reasonable amount, like 2 or 3. In this case, would the ADPC permit a website to gain consent in a joint controllership arrangement for like different providers? So you could express, I don't want this organization tracking me, but I do want this organization tracking me. And how have you dealt with that? Because I can see the industry would immediately say, this doesn't work because you can't give consent to different controllership operations separately from each other. Which would
you can. So basically, that's left open. So basically, you can put anything in the consent field as you wish. So you can basically have 500 with each controller being one field, theoretically. There would be the option to amend that to basically say one purpose and then different joint controllers or entities, whatever you want to call it. That field is not foreseen right now. So right now, what you would have to do is that you would have 500 fields, so to say, do you consent that your data is shared with Google? Do you consent that your data is shared with Facebook, and so on? That would be in the structure doable, but maybe not as nice as if you separate these 2 pieces of information into 2 fields.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. Yeah. So then another sort of follow-up on that is that you said the purposes are then open for the website to provide and give back. How would that interact with user controls? If you want to set your browser settings and have an idea of either common purposes or potentially, as we just said, like common vendors and so on.
Yeah.
At the moment, we know a lot of that happens through the transparency consent framework and things like vendors.json, but also the new version is meant to have some very structured purpose list, which I think is not controlled. Is the idea here that unless you were to actually specify a very specific purpose, the consent would never be given for that unless your purpose exactly matched the one of the website?
So fundamentally, from a design perspective, what we try to do is to be absolutely neutral about all of these discussions. Yeah. To be like, we were basically sitting there as like, if you're a company and I'm a privacy freak, what would we reasonably agree on as a minimum common ground? Now you can design it further into kind of adding these elements, especially if there's case law required. It has a downside as kind of not being as neutral as a standard as you could be. The idea was more to kind of build a pipe with a request and an answer. What then the exact request is, we would leave to anybody else. And that is kind of the idea of that field and what I mentioned before. That could be standardized, for example, by the IAB. So you could just put their purpose list kind of into that request. One option, just thinking about what you said, is one option would be to probably add a structured data field to that as well. Right now we just said, okay, it's a string, whatever you put in there.
Alan?
So I just want to say that the ADPC specification is capable of absorbing high levels of complexity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the right way to go about solving the bigger problem of the ad tech industry and user rights. So I think what we're forced to do is to work in a sense with the legal framework that we're given, whilst also because it's necessary to make a response to the nuisance and badgering of the consent management industry, the consent optimization industry. But the reality is that actually there needs to be a whole series of other institutional changes. I mean, in terms of the practices of advertisers and publishers, and of course, there is some pressure also within the publisher community, for example, to do that, and who are very concerned about the sort of promiscuous position of controllership and joint controllership, and who are advocating for a single controller model, which would put publishers uniquely in an authority position with regard to all of the other processors or parties who are present upon their website. But that's obviously not something that we can dictate through a protocol specification, right? So this is an argument that we can help to air and try to parse from, shall we say, a user's rights perspective and a fundamental rights perspective in terms of the discussions with publishers. But this isn't a silver bullet. It can't fix everything. I think we'll talk a little bit later on, also maybe a bit more about what we call the bulk lists or the white list, because that's one example of the direction where I would see at least some of those solutions lying.
And I can also, just for clarification, say that ADPC is a communication protocol. The example that we use normally is look at it like the email protocol. People can use it to send spams as well, but it doesn't mean that the email protocol has a problem. You need to have other measures to prevent them. Also, sometimes you want to communicate a specific type of data using email protocol, for example, a specific type of file that communicates appointments and events, then you need to develop that on the top of it and then use the communication protocol to communicate. ADPC provides this fundamental change that you can have the privacy data on the user side and allow them to have access to many different supporting solutions. It is not a system that solves everything. It's a protocol. And of course, many other systems will work on the top of it. I hope this kind of clarifies where
also,
we are
just
going.
real quick, from where we're coming from, the idea was to probably put that into e-privacy. I mean, this dream is finally gone, maybe, but that was at least 1.5 years or 2 years ago. The idea, okay, we need that in e-privacy somewhere. And then the idea was to have something that's as neutral as possible to even get it through the political process. Like the more it becomes definitely kind of limiting already on the technical level, the privacy options, it's just very unlikely or more unlikely to get it through. There was just a second question back there.
Thank you so much for the question. Brilliant question.
Hi, this is Yashu from Leiden University. Very small question. So in this ADPC, as a user, will I have an interface where I can see where all I've given my consent?
Yeah.
Can I withdraw my consent in the future?
Yeah.
Now?
Yes.
So basically, the interesting part is, as a default, the consent would be stored in your browser,
Yes.
just like cookies are stored in your browser. So you can locally manage that, have an overview panel where you can see all the consents I've given. I'm thinking a bit of it like, at least in Firefox, you have a list of all the login data that you have, and you can go by website and then see, which login passwords do I have and so on. And it's a very simple kind of like database, so to say, to have a look. And that's a matter of the interface. So it has to be stored somewhere locally. How it's stored, how that's shown, and so on is not part of the specification. The specification only says it goes back and forth. The second part that usually is linked to that question is how about syncing it? So it would theoretically be possible, just like, I'm a Firefox user, sorry for not knowing necessarily how it works with others. But for example, there is the option that you sync your passwords with your different devices as well. So it would be very similar to that it stays basically with you. But it's not impossible that a local plugin would, for example, get these consent bases from a central database. So you could have a cloud storage kind of thing where your consents are, and that could then be synced across devices, for example, or connected to your user account, all of that. Again, that's all not part of the specification. It's more of like, it's possible to do that once a specification like that is there.
Because you mentioned that after 2 prompts, a user should not be prompted again and again. So if I still want to change, then that interface will help me do that.
For example, and all of that, again, is not part of the specification. It was just an idea of what you could do. So there could be a setting that you say, I don't want to be asked a second time, or I only want to be asked the 3rd time I've been to the website. Yeah. Or what I thought is, okay, with the bulk list that we mentioned, that was like the rest of the presentation, is that, for example, the kind of quality publishers, like the biggest issues, the news publishers are dramatic about life in general, and then specifically on privacy. And they definitely wanted to have an option to kind of like keep that in. And that's in a political process, the one big card that's there to block any kind of e-privacy changes, at least when it comes to the cookies. And one idea was that there could be, for example, bulk lists as well. So let's say the quality newspapers of one country would like put a list of saying, that's our members. It would be really cool if you could support them. by allowing them to get more data from you. And that could be something that you install, and there could be, let's say, a NOIB list or whatever, or a list of someone else that says, okay, these are the most terrible trackers the world has ever seen. You should definitely never even be bothered to be asked about them. And your local management could kind of, for example, pull these different lists. We thought a bit about it like spam lists, where your local installation of your email software kind of usually pulls a list in the background, or your server does that, to say, okay, that's kind of spammy domains. You don't even want to see that email, very likely. We just kind of throw it away right away. That is all possible. That's, again, not part of the specification. That's more inspiration for what could be done.
Thank you so much.
We don't have that much time, but any urgent question about the technicality of it, what it is?
Sorry, also for the microphone thing, we hope to have it more like workshop-ish, talkative. So if there's an in-between thing, just holler
always
out,
you
I
can
guess.
interrupt. Nothing urgent. Then let's move on with the second part. That I will talk about the. Let me stand here. It's easier. So, actually, this morning, what I did was, before coming to the workshop, I searched on the start page human privacy, and went to the images. And this was what came. And the very first one is that man over there. That is the first image that you see. And actually, it was very interesting for me. First of all, it's a middle-aged white man. That also shows that many times the problems of privacy are solved for this specific group. Many other groups are left out. Disabled people, people who don't know the language, even cannot read the privacy policies, kids, elderly people, name it, people who have no idea about technical and legal dimensions. Anyway, this was very cute that, the real group that is normally focused was there, but still the person is very freaked out and confused. And if you look at it, look at him, look at the person, and that is what I believe in many cases we do not do, because if you, for example, take the concept of consent, we normally talk about consent. We normally talk about a construct that seems as more or less a binary thing that is set or not set. This is a kind of a legal perspective about consent, that if you either you have given consent or not. But then from that human's perspective, if you look at it from cognitive science perspective, from human psychology and cognition perspective, it is an action. It is not consent. It is consenting. And then, or it's not privacy decision necessarily. It's privacy decision making. It's an action, and it includes contextual, collective, cognitive aspects included in it. And we believe many of these are highly ignored in the current practice of privacy, even if we have started to nag about them. You can read papers that we have written about these things. These are from my previous publications. Still, with the current system, we cannot solve these problems. This is just an example of, after running a representative survey on Austrian population, after running tens of interviews with experts from different fields and so on. This is, for example, a very minimum list of functional and non-functional requirements that people expect when they are dealing with their privacy. Again, it's a very short list. You can expand it, you can go into each of them. When you think about the current situation, you realize that it just doesn't work the way that we are using it. A question that I have asked maybe in the last 5 years in every single talk that I have given, and maybe I have asked more than 2,000 people, I don't know, many people in the last years, do you remember the consents that you have given in the last month, in the last week, in the last day? And especially what you said, that there are hundreds of consents or decisions that you make by one click, you don't know, but behind the scene, actually, you are making a lot of decisions. And then what it is, we have legally the right to withdraw our consent, to the right to understand what's going on, but then no human being, and I do this talk normally for experts, never anyone has claimed I remember, or I have a tool that makes it possible for me to remember it. Why? The main reason is that, and name it, many other things. Also, for example, in many other fields in society, we have collective supports. You can ask other people to help you. It's impossible in privacy because you're alone at your computer. There is no way that you can ask anyone else. There is no way, as Max said, for example, that someone provides you whitelists or blacklists, or in real time you can ask your brother, help me, or an expert to help me. It's impossible to automatize it, to say that, by the way, I trust news agencies, I don't trust search engines, in any way that you want to automatize. Again, we don't want to make decision for users what type of support they need. Is it collective, contextual, cognitive, about representation, about decision making, about any different things that is going on. The thing that we know, and we are very sure about it, is in the current situation, it is literally impossible to provide almost any support, almost, of course, tiny supports here and there you can provide. And we believe what has happened, unfortunately, is that this current practice is problematic, and it's too problematic. And I think that a part of the problem is that we easily see that this is problematic. Because half of my colleagues, maybe more than them, are working on dark patterns and this or that correctly. But then it's like the system is fundamentally problematic, and then we try to polish it. But we don't see that even if you can manage to come up with the best possible cookie banner that has zero dark pattern in it, I don't know, go to the European Commission website, they have a very simplified blah blah version. Still, when you click, there is no record. You cannot memorize it. Still, you cannot automatize it. Still, you cannot ask anyone to help you. Still, name it. The trap is, many of us, I think, have we researchers, we people who are working in this field, we have this cognitive bias that we have found the problem, we have jumped on it, without really questioning why in the first place we need it. And we believe with ADPC, we can go through, and happily I think we have, because I exported it from another operating system, everything that I had here is gone, but that's also maybe not that bad, because we believe this is a very fundamental shift. Why can't we automatize it? Because you have zero access to the data, the privacy data. Why can't you ask someone to help you? Because the data is not on your side. What ADPC allows is that we can bring privacy data to the user side. What we do on the top of it is a matter of user's choice, is a matter of expert choice. Privacy, ADPC itself is agnostic about it. If you are an expert and still you like to have a control panel that is super complex, you can have implementations on the top of ADPC that allows it. You can automatize and. The fundamental problem that we have at the moment is this communication of privacy data is not possible as long as data controllers are controlling everything. I have a paper on this actually. They are controlling mainly three things. One is the data, one is the design, and one is the architecture. Like the very basics, everything is under their control. And the user, we always talk about user empowerment and then it's impossible to empower them by any means. Also, user empowerment from our perspective is not like, okay, bring the data on the user side, then user should make all of the decisions. As I said, collective, automatic, and other types of supports can only be possible if we can move the data to the user side. An example that we give, and I think it would be maybe a very good and interesting point to push you to think about it and question why we are practicing privacy as we are practicing, and maybe think about our socio-technical imaginary that had to end up in our regulations and we didn't actually do that, is the example of you sharing your camera, your webcam, using a browser. The browser always asks you, it's not the website that is asking you. It's always the browser that is asking you, do you want to share this website wants to access your camera. Do you want to share your camera or not? And there are communication means between the website and the browser. Technically, it's very easy. Either it is ADPC or whatever else. The concept is important. Why do we have that? Because I believe having people accessing to our camera is such a strong socio-technical imaginary for our society that we do not accept that people, the data controllers implement it in their own websites. We want it to be very much controlled. We should really ask, why don't we have that for other types of data, other types of personal data? This is one part of the solution from my perspective, that we first agree that every single privacy decision is important. It should be communicated towards to the user side. And then ADPC allows us to do that. And we believe this is the most important fundamental shift that we need for privacy. And then having that, many of the discussions that we have about dark patterns, this or that, just are dissolved. Because, you are just changing the way that it is practiced. And that's it from my side. Sorry for the lack of text, but maybe it was also not that bad. So, any questions about these fundamental reasons that why we need this? Or any comment that you have, because we also like to hear it from your side.
Hi. So I'm wondering if your starting assumption is that privacy decisions are hard for many people.
Yes.
Wouldn't introducing a way for other people to make decisions for them, wouldn't that be dangerous on its own?
It is not the case. As I said, ADPC is agnostic about that. You can have implementations on the top of ADPC that the user themselves make all of the decisions. There is a control panel, or there is a privacy banner pops up every time that there are requests from controllers, and the person answers them one by one. However, if the user wants, it could be automated, it could be supported by other people, you can have lists, you can have different types of agents, you can memorize, name it. My point is ADPC doesn't say that who will make the decisions, it is just a communication mechanism. What it can do is enabling that, all of these potential types of supports. And I agree with you, we need to case by case discuss it. If it is a kit, and we are actually working on ADPC for kids, we are working and we have actually ADPC in IoT systems, different ADPC protocols are coming out, and most of them are developed. Then it is way easier to say that, yes, for kids, the parents should make the decision. But for me, maybe I have to make a decision, do I want to automatize or not? It is, at the end, not a simple question that you're asking. It is a very important question, but still, we will be one step ahead. Because the worst scenario is that you have all of that sophisticated banners that includes all of the requests, at least with not much dark patterns, because there is one design for all of the requests. Second advantage is that at least you will have a record of your decisions. Any decision that you make, there is a record on your computer or anywhere you want, and you can also withdraw. Potentially with ADPC, you can by one click withdraw all of your consents or whatever else, everywhere that you have given, whenever you have given. It is impossible nowadays.
One part where that played in a lot in the discussion is, if the browser is now doing that, isn't Google basically gonna, whitelist all of their stuff? Coming from your question, yeah. And the idea, in my view, is that legally would have to be protected. That basically says the browser can implement technology that helps you, but it would have to be neutral, for example. We may need one or two red lines that are added there. That's right now in the protocol hard to do, because if you say it has to be neutral and they don't do it, what are you going to do as a protocol developer? That could be interesting if, for example, that's implemented in ePrivacy to say, okay, there have to be these and these guidelines. Bottom line is still you have the problem of choosing maybe the wrong source. In my view, it would be more likely that people make one informed choice and think about that source that they attach a bit more in that one moment, when it then kills all the 1,000 requests you get otherwise. It's more likely that people would take that situation, but it is possible that, random, people put out for example, bulk list that says everything is white. That doesn't there is no solution on that here.
And again, don't forget that this is a communication mechanism. Again, it's like sending emails. You know, the operating system that you install has a email app, but you can potentially also download any other email app and use it for sending emails. You can automatize sending emails and here also, even if the browser implemented, I think it should not prevent people to have their own plugins. If Noip develops a plugin for ADPC, maybe you trust it more than browser's plugin, and then you start to use that, it might provide different automation, it might provide different types of support. You know, I believe ADPC is a part of solution, is not all of the solution, but I think it's a very fundamental part of the solution, because without it, we simply cannot do many of the supports that we even want to start to discuss. You know.
Yeah. So I understand the value of the technology. That is plain to see. I was just wondering if you thought that governance discussions should be attached to the technology.
Yeah, right now, no. Right now, the answer was that would be kind of a matter of, for example, e-privacy to say has to be neutral, has to be a separate plugin, whatever. We do have that problem with a lot of other like security decisions, whatever that browsers do, or talking about iPhones suddenly saying, okay, now you can't access this and that stuff on the API. This power of the companies that develop the software is vast, and that's kind of outside of the scope of what we try to fix here. But it is something that we have in discussion. I think you want to.
Actually, I just want to ask what your thoughts are on, like, I mean, where, because I'm interested in what was your motivation behind the question, like what's your thinking, and also if you have any thoughts about how to mitigate it. I mean, we're interested to hear.
What triggered me was the use of collective and automation.
Yeah.
And I immediately thought about USA capital storming mob mentality. So you have a user that is not tech savvy or digital savvy. They need help. They turn to what they think is the trusted network. Who's to say that that network can actually be trusted?
Yeah.
So who defines? We saw Cambridge Analytica manipulating what users' perception to influence elections, right? So we have examples of how you can manipulate somebody into believing what they're doing is right or correct.
But
what do you think is the answer to that problem? I mean, I know this is a big problem, but I mean, I'm curious. I mean, because of course the traditional,
or anybody else here.
Well, there was prior to the age of mass digital communication, right, with a highly centralized broadcast system, where access to capital or access to the airwaves, dictated the people's ability to be able to transmit their messages, right? So it was like, state power on the one side, and a significant kind of capital obstacles, barriers to entry on the other. That world is gone. So the question is, how does one deal? Does one just accept that, for example, that some people are going to make bad choices, and hope that that this is a work in progress, and that I'm just curious, because I don't think that anybody has really resolved this one fully. This question arises all the time, right? In terms of the misinformation and disinformation debates.
Yeah. So I was wondering whether you had already discussed about a way to define trusted authorities or trusted sources, because right now people can make individually bad choices, but if you give them a tool where you allow them to propagate that bad choice to networks of people.
Again, I totally agree with you, and this is very important. ADPC tries to be the data communication means. On the top of that, we will have different types of implementations, and I do agree with you. They should be sustainable, they should be human compatible, they should be accountable, lawful, transparent, understandable, ethical, name it, fair, and we have to audit them. But we perceive that as another problem. First, we want to solve the problem, a very big problem of this power, unbalanced power that all data is under the control of data controllers, and users have zero data. We want to first solve this problem. And of course, the next problem that should be very carefully tackled is exactly what you said. And we don't think that this technology might not have any negative consequences. as I said, similar to email protocol, you can start to spam people. You can send phishing emails. Here also is the same. But then writing that spam detectors and other means to protect users against them is not a part of the email protocol. It's something else. Yeah.
Understood.
Let's move on to, we have very short time to
So there's
more
another
questions.
question at the back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can I just say something very, very shortly, just in response to you? So we actually have a workshop today exactly discussing these kind of topics. It's going to be at 4 here or in the other room here. Exactly. So in case you're interested or everybody's interested, it's really about that. That's it.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Marco Flora from the University of Groningen, and I have 2 questions. First, is this initiative related to the platform for privacy preferences? This is an old proposal of the W3C community, and if not, how is it connected to that? And the second one is maybe a bit more fundamental. Do you think that consent can be expressed in advance? So the way it is conceived in GDPR, or the way I understand in my reading, it's usually a request that comes in and the data subject agrees to it. Do you think that we can reverse this and express consent in advance? That's my question.
In the sense that you already broadcast that you want you to consent to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you pinpoint certain privacy preferences in terms of purposes, maybe recipients, data controllers. Can consent be formed automatically, matching these preferences with the request for accessing data?
It depends if you mean it stays in user's browser or system, or you want to really broadcast it as Max said, because these are different. One option is that the user, sets a set of rules or preferences. Upon request, there is an automated system that sees if it is there is any matching or not, and then makes the decision on behalf of the user based on the preferences. Another option is to broadcast everything to everyone. The later option, I myself think, is very problematic. It can be used for different misuses of data. The first one is a normal rule-based preference
I would
setting.
answer it a bit split. I think legally you can probably say I consent to all of that if you know what it is. I mean, it's always a question of informed, and you can discuss that in detail. It's probably that would go beyond any of this workshop. But I think that could be an option that you in your browser, for example, if there's a standard list of requests that you could say, okay, for this type of request, I always say fine because it's, I don't know, content personalization and I don't care about it. So that could be theoretically part of it. From a design perspective, the broadcast issue is really that you have this tracking surface. So if you send out all the stuff that you consent to, it gives you a lot of options to kind of on the company side to basically always agree because, why not? And so this negotiation would probably turn around. And the other thing is that you have that tracking surface, so you would have more bits about people and be able to track that way. So that's the reason we kind of said, okay, the website should go first.
And the first question?
The first question that's over there. I think.
No, this is not a rerun of P3P because, behind the idea of the specification will be meaningless unless it is actually legally enforceable. It needs to be legally mandated without any time. In a way, that's what the last part of the presentation is about what that landscape looks like. P3P is everybody who
what I suggest,
practices
Alan, is that
yeah.
maybe, thanks a lot for your question. I suggest you start because of timing. You start with your presentation and
I
maybe
think-
also include that. Then we will
Can
have
we just
time
take
for
the one
question.
more? Can we just take that last question because let's take it as
Yes,
part of
let's
it.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So my question is, I'm coming with optimism here. So because user empowerment, do you think a tool like this will rather shift the burden to users? Because as a company, if this becomes very famous, I can imagine Facebook saying that, if you want your data or your consent, why don't you refer to your ADPC itself? So the responsibility of a company giving all this information might reduce. Do you think that will happen?
I didn't understand that fully, to be honest.
Yeah, could you?
The responsibility of giving users all details, such as what's their consent.
At the moment, it is the case. At the moment, you are faced with a banner and you click, and then legally it is assumed that you have read all of that, you have understood all of this, and it's super complex. From that perspective, ADPC doesn't change anything. Companies anyway are doing that, from at least my perspective. But we do not believe in a type of user empowerment that puts all of the load on user side. ADPC at the end is for enabling different types of supports. We do believe the user is empowered at the end, but empowerment doesn't mean that you understand, every single human being will understand everything, spends enough time and makes decision for every single thing. We think that in many other areas in society, we do not do that. If you want to make decisions in almost anything else, there are experts that support you. There are different ways that people come to decision making. Here, this lacks, and we want to solve that problem.
In a very simple term, I mean, you can't stop companies from asking them to give up your fundamental rights. That's fundamentally what consent is like. And as long as people can jump off a bridge and give up their right to life, they can give up their right to privacy. And having them ask you all the time is something that in the current legal framework right now, you can't prohibit. The idea is to put it into a framework or a setting or a structure that is somehow manageable for someone. So we're not like saying you don't have to make the decision anymore, because that's also, I mean, that's the other option that was discussed, to just say, okay, let's just ban targeted advertisement and all of that, and you just cannot consent to that anymore. Then this problem is solved. But as long as you can ask, the question is, can we put in a structure that is more manageable? And I think that's basically what we try to do.
Yeah, thank you. But I really hope that the responsibility of taking care of your consent or your personal data does not shift to users because of a tool like this. It will be helpful to manage.
To be honest, I don't see that. Like it's in reality, as Sohail said, you already have these questions. It's just going to be in a more structured way and probably an easier to understand way and a more manageable way. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, if anything, probably getting better in this issue. Yeah.
One of Mac's slides referred to smart management. So I think that the key for me in terms of responding to your question is that, you know, this creates a framework in which there's innovations possible. There's a series of tools available which can then be automated and packaged into a way which really, you know, operates at like user scale decision making, as opposed to being, you know.
I mean, that could, for example, learn from what you previously said. If you already said 20 times no to personalized advertisement, you could have a system that just says, okay, I learned that guy just doesn't want to have personalized advertisement. I'm not going to ask that anymore. Yeah. Or you could say, okay, we just going to have a wizard at the beginning that asks you, are you interested in these 10 standard things? And then when a request comes in, tries to match that and answer that. So there's shitloads of options, and I haven't even started with the very buzzwordy AI, can ChatGPT do it for me? But there are probably options in that direction.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We will have another short presentation by Alan reflecting on the current how situation, and then we will still have time for Q&As, and also in the coffee break we will be here and would be happy to talk about it.
Okay.
Death by ADPC.
Yes, no, it's all fine. Okay. So there's various versions of this presentation, many of which go into the unhappy history behind user consent and tracking, P3P, do not track, or as it was known at the time, the Tracker Protection Working Group at the W3C. I had the great displeasure to be a participant there for 4 years. There were, I thought there were 17,000 mails sent to the email list that was coordinating that work. Sohail went back and checked. He thinks that it's more along the lines of 12,500 to 13,000. But let's just say that a very large number of human hours were put into the toilet and flushed, really for very little at the end. And what those
just one sentence, just for having one binary bit, which can be 0 or 1. That's 17,000 or something.
So that was the situation even before GDPR. The D&T process began in 2011 at the W3C. It had been a debate that was taking place for a couple of years prior to that. P3P was almost a decade prior to that. P3P, for those of you who don't know, was a previous attempt to automate the interaction between users and websites in terms of the users' preferences and to make that a painless process. So 20 years later, it appears progress isn't linear. With the GDPR, one of the things that you get is, the consent banner. There's a lot of debates actually as to whether this is even necessary or not.
certainly the advertising industry is very keen on it. They spent the past 5 years conducting what is sometimes referred to as consent optimization, which is that process whereby you design the whole interaction so as to make it as difficult as possible for the user to opt out from what you want them to do, which is not exactly the concept of consent which is contained in Article 8.2 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, never mind what's in the GDPR. Anyway, post-2018 and the introduction of GDPR, the mess has kind of continually grown. We have this wreckage that is accumulating behind us. And there is a kind of a consensus as well that has emerged that something needs to be done about it. Something needs to be done. Please, somebody. So how do we clean up the mess? One is reminded of this quote by the Italian author, I think it's Leopardi, who says, in order for everything to stay the same, something's got to change. And so what we've seen over the last 2 years has been a series of initiatives that attempt to do this without getting involved in the very cumbersome legislative projects that take years and years and years. And we'll come back to one of those in a moment, which is e-privacy. So one initiative has been run by the German Ministry for Justice and Consumer Protection, and it is called the Cookie Banner Consent, Good Practice Initiative for Cookie Banner Consent Management. The idea here was really to try to clean up the cookie banner. So I mean, the cookie banners have been replete with, illegality. I mean, in the sense that some of the things are really straightforwardly illegal. I'm sure that Max will have something to say about that later on. Of course, there's a lot of deceptiveness, dark patterns and all that kind of stuff. There's also a lot of things that just don't work. Like, asking people if they consent to something, meanwhile, you've actually already set the cookies on their device. So the whole thing is just like some pantomime. Anyway, so the German ministry, or rather the agency working for them, they ran this long process. They tried to get NGOs, businesses, and various other parties around the table. And one of the key demands was that the cookie banner should be as easy to say no as to say yes, which one would say is probably pretty much a fairly low, but required but not adequate expression of what consent is. You actually have to have a choice, and the companies who would be involved in those discussions resisted this. So that at the end, those guidelines have got a grand total of one corporate signature, and that is Telefonica. And for those who are paying attention to some of the other debates around ad tech, you may be aware that there is an extremely contentious proposal by a series of telecoms companies to replace the identifier. So the identifiers are currently being run on your browser and on your mobile device identifier, whether it's on your Google advertising ID or IDFA for Apple. But those are becoming, IDFA, it's now easy to deny websites access to that or apps access to that. And Google are planning, they promise, at some point to do something similar with Android. So that will mean the disappearance basically of individual identifiers or their loss with regard to an important part of that population. So basically the mobile telephone companies are hoping to get involved in the action because they control your connection to the network, so they can derive from that then an identifier. And Telefonica is, so then they can move in and get involved in the whole behavioral advertising business and take over a section of it. And Telefonica are one of the players in that. They are part of a corporate, I don't know how one would call it, a joint venture. They were notified the European Commission about this, in fact, last summer. And so, of course, they are very keen. They're aware of the fact that this is an extremely controversial proposal. And they're very keen to be seen as playing with clean hands. So maybe that's the reason why they are the sole corporate signature to the cooking up the cookie guidelines. There is a voluntary pledge on cookie fatigue that has been run by the DG Justice at the European Commission. Again, this seems to have a lot to do with trying to clean up some of the worst practices. But the key word here, however, is that it is voluntary. This will not be a legally enforceable pledge or legal instrument. This is soft law. And to be honest with you, I mean, it represents no advance on what we had 20 years ago from P3P or 12 years ago from the do not track signal. It's the same thing. There will be no penalty applied to refusing to honor the user's preference. In those talks, the publishers are continuing to resist because the Commission is interested in ideas around browser or user-controlled privacy preference system. They have been for many years. In fact, it was an element of the original e-privacy proposal 6 or 7 years ago. But the publishers are resisting this, and they're resisting this on the basis that this is an unjustified intervention into their right to have a direct relationship with the user and carry out that negotiation about consent with them directly. And they are claiming that to cut them out is to basically preference then browser companies like Google, who of course have their own objectives and agenda in the ad tech sector. There's no question that that is true. And it is very, I think everybody realizes that going after Google for the self-preferencing that they have been conducting in ad tech for 15 years is essential, however. But really, I think that publisher position that says, you can't stop us from showing the cookie banner is indicative to me that there has really been very little progress, at least in terms of publishers thinking, or at least publishers thinking as expressed by their trade organizations, which isn't always the same thing as what all publishers think, because there's actually quite a plurality of opinion there. Some publishers take much more progressive positions and are aware that the tide has changed. Max maybe can talk about this a little bit, himself, but I mean, obviously NOIB has filed hundreds of complaints with DPAs across Europe. The EDPB formed a task force, in fact, to manage these complaints and produced a report in January, which examined some of the principal defects. Those are similar, the usual things, which are around, dark patterns, deceptive buttons, unjustified use of claims of legitimate interest, pre-clicked tick boxes. It's the whole gamut of gory bad practices which we've seen since 2018. Other developments, probably for me, one of the most interesting regulatory developments actually was the fact that CNIL both fined Google, and also issued guidelines which ended up with Google installing a reject all button in terms of their own products. I think this is significant because, as was mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of focus on third-party tracking, not so much on the first parties and on, the companies that are arguably really at the center of data power or whatever today. And then the last thing is that there is this, we actually already have this automated signal which is in use in California, the Global Privacy Control. And the California Attorney General's office is taking some enforcement action. There was a first settlement made with a company called Sephora in August last year around that, which both fined them and also required that they modify their practices so as to accept users' opt-outs on the basis of the automated signal set in their browser. In the void created by this legal mess, of course, technology companies are to some degree stepping in. So you see that, for example, the browser extension Ghostery, which is typically an anti-tracking extension, they basically have automated the process of trying to say no. That's going to be incomplete, but they are basically trying to automate the refusal of consent. DuckDuckGo are doing something similar. The Brave browser is doing something a bit different. It just blocks those cookie banners altogether. Google, as you know, of the plan to eliminate third-party cookies. They've delayed it already twice. There's a new deadline set for 2024. We'll see if that happens. And then at that point, they will be joining essentially what is otherwise a kind of a browser industry consensus as represented by Safari, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, Brave. Everybody's blocking third-party cookies. I think that this, opens the question as to who decides exactly what are the legitimate forms of profiling and tracking that users should be exposed to, and which are the ones that are not legitimate. So there's a big focus on the third-party tracking and profiling industry. But as already mentioned, of course, Google and Facebook, TikTok, Amazon, the biggest profilers, the biggest surveillance players are those who are actually collecting data on a first-party basis. Let's leave that aside and also think about the fact that the elimination of the third-party cookie doesn't mean the elimination of third-party data. So actually what I think we're looking into now in terms of a new ad tech system is one where people try nonetheless to get unique identifiers, and they will do that by having email-based logins. We see it, there isn't the time to talk about this now, but they're so-called universal IDs produced by companies like The Trade Desk or LiveRamp, ID5 in the UK. And they will use those identifiers then so as to go hunt for information about users in online data marketplaces, which are run also by by the ad tech companies. And they will and they will produce larger profiles so as to create more detailed view onto potential, subjects for advertising exposures, but based now on offline data or on third-party data. It's not just about third-party cookies. I think there's a big question here about the way in which the power to define what is okay and what's not okay has been delegated to parties which really have their own commercial interests, which may sometimes converge with users and other times will diverge from them. I'm sorry that I'm going on too long, but e-privacy, very little progress. This is now, I think we're into year 7 here. There is a big problem because there are a couple of member states who are determined that the e-privacy regulation will contain provisions around data retention, and which has already, of course, been rejected by the European Court of Justice and so on and so forth. But it looks as if that this may sink the entire proposal, which is pretty ironic that the reforms that we were kind of hoping for in ad tech sense may be stymied for reasons that are completely extraneous, in fact, to our own debates. In the absence of an e-privacy regulation, there isn't going to be, I think that the prospects for legally mandated user signals in privacy terms are very, very low. And we'll have to wait until there is sector-specific regulation for the ad tech sector. So this is the end. So it's just, what's the outlook? Well, there's no real progress in terms of the mechanics, but the consensus is changing. That stuff that, the changes that the browser companies have made, I think they do reflect a kind of a broader societal shift. For 20 years, ad tech basically argued that there was no harm. You know what I mean? That what privacy advocates were complaining about was basically just like a phantasm of their own imagination. I think that there's a broad societal acceptance actually that this stuff is a major problem these days, and the browser companies. Their changes at a technical level reflect that. It reflects also where they think people's minds are going. And I think that's something not to be underestimated within all of the more detailed technical argument.
We have to be out in 5 minutes, so we'll probably, if we want to have any discussion here still, we're probably going to wrap it up there.
Okay.
I think fundamentally what for the room would be interesting is to also think about our original idea with this was to wrap it into e-privacy. Now, e-privacy is probably not going to go anywhere. One part that was an interesting part is the kind of self-pledge that Reinders foresees. I personally don't think it's going to go anywhere, but one option would be, for example, to have the consent management platforms that are basically producing the cookie banners include some signal like that, for example, in a pledge. So mainly what I think in the last part would be interesting, especially from the room, is thoughts about how to move that forward other than in e-privacy. We usually had the part in GDPR that says there has to be a signal, but for us, as from a legal perspective, it's hardly enforceable. And there was also the discussion, theoretically, you could just spam companies with opt-outs because they cannot define how you communicate with them. You can send them an email or a pigeon or whatever. And one option would be to send an email or a pigeon or a letter, unless you basically comply with a signal that is more, that was kind of the guerrilla tactic of moving stuff like that forward. So I was wondering if we want to have a bit of a exchange on that.
I just want to, like a last line.
Yeah, please.
And then I'm just going to hand it over. Okay. All of this stuff, can you give consent in advance? Who should make the decisions? The decisions at the moment, they're not real decisions because nobody understands anything that's going on. Even people who are actually at the who created the ad tech industry can't explain why certain ads are shown to them. In order to be a choice, you need to be able to understand what the options are. You go to a restaurant. Are you a vegetarian? Get a vegetarian dish. You're a pescatarian? Get fish. You eat meat? There's a meat option. If you want energy, do you prefer to buy nuclear energy? Do you prefer renewables from wind or water? Or do you want fossil fuels? These are kind of like choices that we can get our minds around. The choices that we're being offered at the moment online about the way the advertising industry works. These are not choices. This is theatre. Okay, so.
Thank you. Leave it at that. Thanks a lot, Alan, for the talk. Any questions, any thoughts that you have, anything you'd like to share? If not, I have a few things to say. Actually, there is one. Let's start with this.
Yeah, I can also wait for you to...
I just wanted, before everyone maybe disappear, wanted to say that we have a W3C community group, which is called W3C Consent Community Group. If you like, you can join us there and continue this type of discussions there. Also, we have the website, dataprotectioncontrol.org. You can check out our specification and other materials that we have there. Plus, we have a GitHub repository that also different versions of ADPC, as I said, ADPC IoT and the rest would also be available there. We would be very happy to have you in some capacities on board, either for enforcing this, either for developing plugins on top of it to solve the problems that the colleagues said, or any aspects that you think might be helpful. Yeah, sorry.
Hi. Midas Nouwens from Organised University. I'm more interested in ADPC as a discursive device than I think as a technology, because for me this has never really been there's never been a lack of a technological solution to some of these things, right?
I agree with you.
D3P is all the stuff.
Exactly.
So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about what you're doing and what the response has been using this as an example to change people's minds about what is possible to regulators.
That was exactly what we wanted to do with this. I mean, to be honest, like we also said, it doesn't have to be ATPC that does it. We just need something like that. I don't care if it's this one or another one. So at least from my perspective, the response on the e-privacy discussion was that it's interesting. Same thing now with the kind of pledge that Reinders foresees, that we could squeeze it somewhere in there. In all of that, like literally every time that the political discussion comes up, they're like, oh, we should do a signal, blah, 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 blah. The point that we wanted to add here is to say it's doable. You can look at it, there's a website, you can download it, it works. For me, the big interesting part is in which political field could we get it in? That's also the part why we don't kind of actively do as much on it as NOIP, for example, because right now with e-privacy not really moving, where is it going to go? And the pledge would be one of these options. I'm not a big fan of the idea, but you know, whatever commissioners make up late night. And that would be the really interesting part if there is more theories or more options to put it for. We had the guerrilla tactic as the first one, then the e-privacy one, now the pledge is around. And that's a bit like my biggest issue right now as well.
I really like your question. It's very, very amazing that you're asking this. I can say something in very general, but later maybe in coffee break I can, if you want, I can open it up privately for you. ADPC also allows us, at least allowed me, to identify many conflicts of interest that you cannot imagine without it. We have been in contact with browser companies, with content management platforms, with DPAs, with governments, with people and companies and service providers and NGOs who claim that privacy is in the center of their business models or their approaches. And as soon as you provide something that can change the system fundamentally and maybe solve the problems, some of them really see that, we might go out of business actually, because as long as privacy is a problem, I can be, a service provider for privacy. But if this really shifts and the problem is kind of solved, or at least the problem is fundamentally transformed to some other problems that our colleague was aiming to, then they are very resistant. This is something very interesting with ADPC that I perceived. You realize that many people seem to kind of like things to stay like this so that we can keep nagging and selling things, which is very crazy, I know. Any other questions? My only last sentences that then we can finish. We talked a lot about more consent and user decisions, but just as a final remark, ADPC can also be used to transfer privacy information and decisions and preferences and many other types of data. This is important. Plus, this is not Eurocentric per se. We have considered GDPR, but you can also send, do not sell like signals that for Californian case, or DNT like signals. The user can initiate the interaction, the data controller can initiate interaction. The protocol allows for many different setups. You can use it to, implement Indian data protection laws, and. It should not necessarily be GDPR or e-privacy or whatever in Europe, just to make sure that this is also clear what the protocol is about. Thank you so much for your attention, and see you soon. Cheers.